Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Let me welcome all of you to this ICS conversation on the outlook for the Chinese economy in the Covid era, hosted by the Institute of Chinese Studies. We have the Print as a media partner. We have a very impressive panel today. This conversation will be anchored by Ambassador Shyam Sharan, former Foreign Secretary of India and one of our most respected diplomats, a distinguished public intellectual and China expert. He is a member of the Governing Council of the ICS. We also have two of the most distinguished economists of China, Prof Chen Zhiwu and Prof Yang. Prof Chen is Director of Asia Global Institute, Chair Professor of Finance, and Victor and William Fung Professor in Economics at the University of Hong Kong. We have as a guest speaker, Prof Yang, Director, China Center for Economic Research and Dean, National School of Development at Peking University. It's a really formidable panel and I welcome them. I thank them all for joining us this afternoon. Today, we'll be exploring how the Chinese economy is coping with the impact of COVID-19. As you know, China was the initial epicenter of COVID-19, but it has done rather well in containing the domestic spread, though there have been a few isolated cases in Peking of late, but situation remains largely under control. And China has also made remarkable progress towards restoring normal economic activities since the lockdown was lifted several weeks ago. Of course, it continues to face a number of challenges, including the risk of second surge of the pandemic. Our panelists will assess the progress made by China in its economic revival, look at continuing challenges, and also assess the prospects of the Chinese economy in months to come. They will also look at three related questions. One, how the pandemic has affected the Belt and Road Initiative and its future directions. Two, are we moving towards a substantive or radical economic decoupling between the USA and China? And three, what's the nature of changes taking place in global value chains, especially China's role therein in the aftermath of COVID-19? Friends, before we start the dialogue, let me explain some ground rules. For the first 35 minutes or so, Ambassador Shyam Sharan will have a conversation with Prof Chen Zhiwu and Prof Yang, when we'll mute all other participants. Already, in fact, all other participants are muted. Thereafter, we'll have the Q&A session involving other participants. You may indicate your interest in asking questions by using the raise hand option available at the bottom of the participants list. Questions can also be sent to Ambassador Sharan through the chat option. Ambassador Sharan will call on participants to raise their questions. The concerned participant will unmute himself or herself. Other participants are requested to keep themselves muted so that we don't have ambient or background noise disturbing our proceedings. I will now hand over to Ambassador Shyam Sharan, who will conduct the rest of the proceedings this afternoon. Over to you, Ambassador Sharan.
Thank you very much, Ashok, for that introduction. And let me extend a very warm welcome to Professor Yang and Professor Chen Zhiwu to this webinar. Ashok has already spelled out some of the issues that we would like to cover. So let me first pose a question to Ambassador Yang with respect to the current situation of the Chinese economy and what we expect in the coming months. So, Professor Yao, some of the reports that we see seem to suggest that, in fact, even though China seems to have started its recovery from the pandemic rather earlier than other major economies, but it is expected that maybe China might end this year, according to some analysts, perhaps either with a zero rate of growth or with even a negative rate of growth. So that is one set of assessments which have been made. There is another set of assessments which seem to indicate that some of the latest figures which we are seeing in respect to, for example, of recovery of industrial production, some recovery in terms of exports, and perhaps even some recovery with respect to employment, China will perhaps be one of the very few countries that might end up the year with a positive rate of growth. Given your understanding of where things are currently in China, to which assessment would you, in fact, tend to have your opinion? Would you expect that China, which is the second largest economy, with has in fact a positive rate of growth, this will also mean a lot for the recovery of the global economy? So, what is your view with regard to is there a real recovery taking place? Do we look at perhaps China being the front runner in terms of recovery? Professor Yao.
Okay, thank you, Vanska, for this nice introduction. And I also want to thank ICS for organizing this panel discussion. So to answer Ambassador's question, let me say this. Look, the first quarter, China's economy dropped by 6.8% year on year. So now we are at the end of the second quarter. So April, I think we still had a negative growth between like -3% to -4%. May still a little bit minus, and then June probably close to a positive. So in the end, I would say that the first half of the year, we are going to see a drop of 2% in terms of annual growth. Okay. So to maintain a positive growth rate for the whole year, then we have to have at least a 4% growth rate for the second half of the year. I think if we don't have the second wave of the virus outbreak, 4% is almost a guarantee, right? Because the government has started stimulus plan, right? 2 trillion RMB will be spent mostly on consumption and the employment benefits. So with this kind of subsidies, consumption will come up, okay? But to make the economy to grow like to 3%, I think that's going to be hard for the whole year, right? Investment still has a negative growth year on year. The latest figure, I think, like minus 10%. Okay, so we cannot count on investment to bring the Chinese economy to kind of a positive growth rate territory. Okay.
May I ask, Professor, if I may just interrupt? It is also a fact that for some years now, the role of consumption in the Chinese economy has been steadily rising. Yeah. That is, a lot of the growth in the Chinese economy has been coming as a result, not so much of infrastructure investment, etc., but because of a very impressive rise in domestic consumption. Right. Now, my understanding is that because of the COVID-19 pandemic, there seems to have been a rather depressing impact on consumption in China. Yeah. And even though some stimulus has been provided by the Chinese government, it would appear that because of maybe uncertainty or because of some insecurity, the attempt to have consumption recover and lead the recovery, that does not seem to have succeeded so far. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely right. Actually, I was about to get to that point, right? So we cannot count on investment, but then we have to boost our consumption, right? But as you just said, there are a lot of uncertainties. For example, Beijing now is having a kind of a second wave of outbreak. Although the situation is very much contained and under control, but the government has been really cautious. So economic activities have been slowed down again. So yesterday we went to a restaurant. There were not many people in those restaurants, right? So there is a problem of that. So that's why I want to emphasize that the government should gear up subsidy programs to ordinary residents and particularly to the poor. So many cities have started to give free consumption coupons to people. But this is more like a lottery, a kind of a voluntary lottery. So for example, in Beijing, we need to go to this bigger retailer network called Jingdong, right? So we go there, we get a consumption coupon, but many people got the coupons for just for fun. They don't use it. So that's a wasteful. I think a better strategy is for the government to just give people electronic cash, right? So there is a limit of time for people to spend this money. Is it still cash?
Okay, I think
there's a limit.
Yeah,
okay.
I think, Professor, we will come back to the the Chinese economy, the internal economy, somewhat later. Let me turn to Professor Chen Zhiwu and perhaps take up a couple of other issues with regard to China's economic revenue. Professor Chen, you are in Hong Kong, and I wanted to draw attention to a couple of issues which have recently come up. As you know, there is going to be a meeting between the Secretary of State, the US Secretary of State Pompeo, and also the Chinese State Councilor Yang Jiechi in Hawaii. Meeting has been announced. And it is expected that they will be also perhaps talking about the larger issue of US-China relations, in which the trade war between the two sides, I'm sure, will be an important component. But what I hear is that China is fully committed to, implementing the phase 1 of the trade agreement which has been reached between the two sides. And what is perhaps very important is that there has been, in the last few days, a decision by the US Department of Commerce that US companies and Huawei will be engaging in a dialogue in order to see how the standards could be set for the 5G network. This, to me, seems to be an important step forward because, as you know, one of the very key controversies between the US and China has been with respect to Huawei. So, Professor Chen Zhiwu, since you look at the economic issue from the external point of view, what would you say is the prospect going forward for perhaps some kind of a, if not reconciliation, some kind of a understanding, limited as it may be, between the US and China? Professor Chan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, first of all, I'm so happy to see so many friends and familiar faces. So I'm really glad and appreciate this opportunity. Regarding the meeting that's going to take place our time tonight in Hawaii, I would say we should not expect too much. Of course, at this time, any dialogue, any meeting between the two sides is good because, whether they're going to reach any agreement or not, at least it makes sense to let the other side hear my side or his sides of the story and the positions and so on. And I've also noticed that a few days ago, the People's Daily and CCTV evening news suddenly changed the tone on the US, especially on the public enemy #1. Pompeo. Some of you have probably read that CCTV on many days tried to make the point that Pompeo is public enemy #1, but nonetheless, a relatively warm environment has been created over the last few days, at least as far as the official media in China are concerned. But the reason that I say we should not expect too much to come out of it is that the fundamental drivers that have led to the worsening relations between the two countries are not changed at all. I do realize that the decoupling between the US and China, it's going to take a long time. I mean, it's not going to happen overnight. So this is probably why the Commerce Department relaxed its restrictions on American companies' interactions with Huawei, because while the White House may have been able to make a decision within a second, practically speaking, it would take a much longer to implement such a decision. Just over the last few days, as an example, when I talked to executives of mainland banks based in Hong Kong, they have been really having a tough time, because after the US, after Pompeo and then Trump declared that the US is going to end the special trade status for Hong Kong and many other things. So all the Chinese banks based in Hong Kong were told to move all the US dollar assets and whatever they can out of the US, just to get ready for possible more serious sanctions and so on. But those bank executives were scratching their heads, thinking, what can we do? Because as long as we have those dollar accounts with any bank, every transaction in US dollars has to be cleared through the SWIFT system. So there's no way to hide or to escape the restrictions and controls by US institutions such as the SWIFT. So the bank executives still are trying to figure out. Of course, some of them complain to me, it's very easy for the leaders in Beijing to say, okay, move all the money out, move all the assets out of US banks and US institutions. But then the bank executives right away thought, okay, well, where to? How are we going to change that? In some cases I mentioned, or maybe you guys can increase the euro assets and so on, but they all realize the euro, the liquidity.
But Professor Chen, may I just interrupt and perhaps ask you, the session which you are telling us about, does this show that the Chinese leadership is quite confident that in fact some kind of decoupling that is taking place and may continue to take place, that they have in fact measures in place to be able to somehow insulate the Chinese economy from the impact? Because if not, then does this not have also a major impact on the prospects for Chinese economy to recover?
Oh, definitely. I think maybe just quickly, one way to appreciate the situation is, I think the Chinese side, the leaders in Beijing are confident that in the long run, China can afford to have this, to face this decoupling. So they have been preparing on the technology side to decouple the Chinese tech sectors from the US, and on also the financial side, they are confident, at least to some extent, that they can decouple from the US. But in the short run, there will be a lot of turmoil and some unexpected surprises will likely happen. So this is why, as far as the impact of the decoupling on the Chinese economy is concerned, I would say in the short run, just as Professor Yao mentioned, for the second quarter of this year, or even for the second half of this year, 2020, the Chinese economy is likely going to show a lot of fast recovery and significant recovery because, the US and other countries have not really had the time to implement whatever decoupling they want to do. This includes the European Union countries and the UK as well. So once the coronavirus situation stabilizes in the US, the EU, and other countries, they will probably spend more time to actually implement decoupling. So the impact of decoupling on the Chinese economy is more likely to show up more next year, 2021 and 2022, through technology, through financial services, and also through especially international trade. For one thing, as we all know, the Chinese economy depends on international trade so much. So import plus export for China is about 38% of China's GDP. So with that level of dependence on international trade, a friendly international environment is very, very, very key. But of course, at this point, the international environment for China is kind of falling apart, including the latest unfortunate clash with India. Something like that should not have happened, but it's happening, or also happened yesterday. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me turn back to Professor Yao Yang again with respect to the direction which the Chinese economy is taking. Recently we saw that perhaps there is some kind of a disagreement, perhaps even at the leadership level, with regard to some of the measures to be taken for the recovery. For example, the Premier mentioned that there is a very important role to be played by the small economy, in the sense of food stalls or small shops, small establishments. That this had the potential of generating quite a large amount of investment. A large amount of employment, particularly at a time when the economy has been rather badly hit as a result of the pandemic. And the Premier, in fact, put his stamp of approval on the promotion of the small economy. Very quickly afterwards, we saw that there was a reaction to that, and in some of the official media, there seems to have been a disagreement that the Chinese economy, having become somewhat more sophisticated, somewhat more modernized, it should not slip back into the kind of informal small-scale economy that it had been in the past. Now, this links up with the issue of employment, because even though the figure today is that maybe there might be 6% or maybe 8% unemployment, if we take into account the large number of migrants who have perhaps gone back to their villages, maybe they have not quite come back, perhaps the unemployment figure is larger than we think it is. So there is one issue that I would like you to address is, is this a serious division in the leadership? And secondly, I would also like you to perhaps say a few words about what the employment situation is, because that is also very closely linked to social stability, which is a very important objective for the leadership. And lastly, in that context, I would like you to perhaps comment on, there is the objective of Xiaofang Shagui, or a reasonably well-off society for China, which should have been, achieved by 2020, according to the targets which were set before. Perhaps it might be difficult to reach that unless the Chinese economy continues to grow during the rest of the period at a much higher rate. But I think it should be perhaps fair to say that maybe that target is somewhat more difficult to reach right now. And lastly, in that context, the statement made by February that 600 million Chinese are perhaps not as well off as people think they would be, because their income is only $140 US per month. So there is still a long way to go in terms of elimination of poverty. While there seems to be another view that China has already, in fact, achieved poverty eradication from the country. Would you like to comment on some of these issues?
You have raised many questions. First, for your first question, we call it strict employment. Right? It's not about all the small business. It's just about strict employment. It all started from Chengdu, the capital city of Sichuan province, right? So in order to temporarily increase employment, the city allowed more people to start a food stands, whatever, on the street, right? That actually had a big effect to boost the employment. So the premier recommended this to other cities. Of course, some of those first tier cities expressed some reservation for this proposal because they believed that they really don't need that many street employment to boost or to reduce unemployment rate, right? I think this is quite normal and quite healthy, right? So we should impose kind of one policy for all the cities. For the unemployment rate, China only have a figure for urban unemployment, and that rate was 6% in April. I haven't seen the number for May. So that's for urban unemployment. But if we add in migrant workers, I would put it probably somewhere between 8% to 10% for the whole country, right? But recently, some of those migrant workers have been absorbed by the labor market, right? Your third question about the well-off society. No, I don't think we are going to be able to reach that goal. Because to reach that goal, we have to get 5.6% growth this year. But as I said, to get to 3%, that's going to be difficult, not to mention 5.6%. But that's fine, it's just 1 year. So I think the top leaders have been quite aware of this delay. But, this is just 1 year. If the virus does not come back next year, it's very easy for China to get like a 6 or 7% growth next year, right? Because this year is so low. Okay, so by next year, definitely we are going to reach that goal. So the premier mentioned low-income people. Yeah, I have to clarify. This is a per capita income, not the wage rate. This is just for whole family on average, right? So suppose you have 2 wage earners in your household, but you have like 4 people in your household, right? So the actual wage rate should be higher than this. I have to mention that the income distribution in China is really bad. It's almost as bad as in the US, probably more even worse. Okay, the top 1% accounts for more than 30% of the whole country's wealth. Okay, top 10% accounts for about 70% of total wealth. Top 10%, the average income of top 10% is about 53 times of the average income of the lowest 10%, right? So income distribution is really bad, but over the last 10 years it has been improved. Right? The worst time, I think, is gone. The worst time is actually was around 2008, right? So that in that period of time it was even worse. Now has been a little bit better. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. We have just maybe about 5 minutes or so for covering a couple of other questions. So let me turn back to Professor Chen with two questions that I have. One is relating to the possible impact of what has happened with this pandemic on the progress on the Belt and Road Initiative, because that is a flagship initiative of President Xi Jinping himself. And at least the initial reports seem to indicate that in many cases, the projects have been held up or delayed. There may be a problem in the repayment of loans that various partner countries have taken for some of the somewhat ambitious infrastructure projects. I hear that China has, in fact, either rescheduled some of the debts or maybe in some cases may even have forgiven some debts. We don't have any information on that. But given the fact that this is such an important part of China's, external sort of role, and particularly because it is so closely linked personally to President Xi Jinping's, vision of China's role in the world. What is the impact on the Belt and Road Initiative of what we have seen happen, and how do you see this impact going forward? Are we going to see a drawing down of this initiative, or are we going to see that there will be a doubling down, in a sense, of pushing this initiative forward? That is one aspect. The second aspect, which is not directly related to this, but it is something that perhaps we should look at. That China has been working on a digital currency, not a cryptocurrency, but a digital currency, a digital yuan. And the latest news is that when the Winter Olympics are held in 2021, that will be the time when this digital yuan may be launched full scale in China. And with that, there is also a proposal that perhaps China, Japan, South Korea, and Hong Kong should be looking at perhaps launching something like a Asian, digital currency, which would be backed by the Japanese yen, by the South Korean won, the Hong Kong dollar, and of course, very importantly, the Chinese yuan. So this is also quite an ambitious project on the part of China, and the ground seems to be laid for at least the Chinese digital currency. I'm not quite sure about the Asian digital currency, but it seems to link to what you mentioned earlier, that the Chinese government, in fact, has taken the decision or conveyed to mainland companies in Hong Kong that they should perhaps, get out of dollar assets. So, are you looking at in the future, perhaps, that this would be a serious step on the part of China, not only the digital yuan, but even looking at an Asian digital currency? Professor Chen.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. First, let me get back to the stimulus or the reaction policies to the coronavirus in China. one way, or at least from my perspective, one way to understand how the Chinese government has responded to the challenge from the virus is that the US, Germany, Japan have focused their rescue packages much more at the small businesses and households very directly, because the small businesses are where most of the employment comes. On the other hand, the Chinese government's response has been quite different. Not so much focused on directly rescuing or saving the small to mid-sized enterprises, the private firms. Neither has the government really focused on, helping those families that have been affected the most. Instead, more efforts are put on a new infrastructure projects and other such efforts. So in some ways, the government in Beijing has tried to use this opportunity to promote more nation building rather than, protecting employment that has been provided by the small to mid-sized enterprises. That's just my quick take on this point. Let me now come back to your two questions. One is related to the Belt and Road, the BRI project. Definitely the coronavirus has dampened a lot of the excitement or focus on the BRI. So I think one way to understand this is that the BRI is going to sustain and stays important for as long as the Chinese economy has no problems internally. So if the financial system, especially the Chinese economy, gets into any kind of crisis, then the BRI would have to be put on the second priority list if there's any priority at all. But as you said correctly, because this is a project specifically linked to the current leader, Xi Jinping, so he will do whatever he can to try to keep this project alive as long as the domestic economy and society are not falling apart. So I would say this coronavirus has definitely presented a major first test, first round of major challenge to the BRI. So many of the participant countries correctly are getting worried about whether this whole thing will continue or not. So that's the BRI question. And then regarding the digital yuan, digital currency from China, or the Asian digital currency, to put it simply, I mean, we should not imagine that a digital renminbi would be more globally accepted than the actual physical renminbi. So if the physical renminbi is not yet internationalized, I think the chances for the digital renminbi to be internationalized should be way, way lower. So in that sense, given that the coronavirus has created this situation in which so many countries are complaining about China and the US and some other developed countries want to decouple more from China, I think at this time, the likelihood for success for the digital yuan or whatever they want to call it to succeed, I think that likelihood is not that high. So in that sense, this coronavirus has also undermined or cut the likelihood for this effort to really succeed. Regarding a pan-Asian or pan-Northeast Asian digital currency, that's, I would say, even much more remote. If the three countries are South Korea, Japan, and China can really work together, that would be a big success. Whether they end up creating a new digital currency for the three countries involved, I think they anyway, the prospect.
So, Professor, in view of what you just said, would you agree that the role of Hong Kong, which has proved to be a very useful intermediary in a sense between China and the rest of the world, particularly because the Hong Kong currency is convertible and the Hong Kong currency is linked to the US dollar, pegged to the US dollar. It has played a very important role in terms of helping China to engage with the capitalist world in a sense. So if we take that into account, would you agree that perhaps the role of Hong Kong as a financial center will continue to be very important for China? It is unlikely that that role will be diminished.
Yeah, it's a very very good question. Very good point. I have to say, most people in Beijing don't really fully appreciate how important Hong Kong has been over the last 40 years of fast economic growth and internationalization of the Chinese economy and society. But after 10 days ago, Trump announced that the US would remove the special trade status for Hong Kong. Many people now in Hong Kong and in Beijing think that, well, how significant is that? Because Hong Kong does not export that much to the US anyway. If anything, the US enjoys a trade surplus with Hong Kong. So removing that status by itself will not have much direct impact. Definitely that is true. But the way most people view this change in the US position towards Hong Kong much more broadly, because this, if this really becomes an overall removal of everything that the US has given to Hong Kong and to treat Hong Kong as a society totally autonomous and totally separate from the mainland. So once that separation is removed as a result of the new US policies and as a result of the new national security law, then the roles played by Hong Kong as a key financial center and a key buffer between China on the one hand and the US and other countries on the other hand. Once that buffer role is gone, and then Hong Kong becomes just like another city of China, then I don't know how China can actually find a new buffer, a new intermediary that is acceptable to both China and the rest of the world. Once the reality of such a change becomes more clear to people, then I think a lot of regrets will be expressed out of Beijing. But at this point, many people will say, well, how important is Hong Kong? Well, they say Hong Kong's GDP is even less than Shenzhen's GDP. In terms of Hong Kong's GDP as a percentage of the overall Chinese GDP is very negligible. But
it's only 3%.
We know we cannot
3% of Chinese GDP. Yes.
Yeah.
So I very much agree with your view that perhaps the role which the Hong Kong plays has not been perhaps fully appreciated perhaps in Beijing. So I would like to express my very, very deep thanks to Professor Yao Yang and Professor Chen Zhiwu for being so patient in answering all the questions that I raised. And I think we have a much better understanding of where we are with regard to China's economic recovery. And not only that, but what is the outlook for the future in terms of China's role in the global economy? After all, it is the second largest economy in the world today. It has a very major, therefore, impact on the prospects of the global economy. So in one sense, the early economic recovery of China is good news for the global economy. But I think in terms of the sort of tensions which are building up between China on the one hand, the US on the other hand, and also how this impacts on, say, the role of Hong Kong or even the larger region of Southeast Asia, East Asia, I think this is something which will continue to engage our attention in the coming days. So thank you very much, both very distinguished professors, for answering all our questions and giving us a better understanding of where we are today. Now, before we get into question and answer sessions, I would like to invite our media partner, The Print. We have Jyoti Malhotra, Ms. Jyoti Malhotra also with us today. Jyoti, you would like to perhaps raise a couple of questions, very short questions, I would hope. And please indicate whether you would like Professor Chen Zhiwu to answer that, or you would ask Professor Yao Yang to answer that, or would you like to pose them to both our distinguished panelists? So, Jyoti, you have the floor.
Right. Thank you so much, Ambassador Saran, and thank you so much, Ashok, for this opportunity to ask Professor Yao Yang and Mr. Chen Zhiwu. I hope I have your pronunciations right. I just have one question actually to both of you, and this is really a continuation of what you have just said. The first is on U.S.-China relations. In the wake of COVID, in the wake of both Trump and the Chinese leadership's relations deteriorating, how do you look at the economy and how does China expect to sort of come back and be this powerful nation, this rising economic power? And my second question is regarding India-China, or perhaps that's the first question, both. And, in the wake of clashes, you've seen that India and China have had clashes on the border about 24 hours ago, in which several soldiers, both Indian soldiers as well as Chinese soldiers, have died. So, Mr. Yao Yang, or Professor Yao Yang, what has been the response in Beijing? Do you think that there is some talk, not just because of the clashes, but in terms of the deteriorating relationship between India and China, is there talk about the economy, whether this will impact the economy? And to yourself also, Mr. Chen Zhiwu, the reaction to this. Thank you so much.
Okay, so may I first call upon Professor Yao Yang to, if you could perhaps share your thoughts with us on the question raised by Jyoti.
Yeah, so let me answer the second question. I think Zhiwu can answer the first question. So yes, there was a kind of a clash between Indian soldiers and the Chinese soldiers at the border. I don't think this will change the relationship between the two countries. We know over the last several years, this kind of incidents happened several times. This is more like boys fighting on the street, right? They were not really military clash, right? It's just a street fight. So I don't think that will have any real impact on the relationship, right? But of course, both countries should refrain from allowing the situation to get worse, right? So if getting worse and worse, then there could be real military clashes, right? But by far, I don't think it matters that much.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I think regarding the India-China relations question, I have to say, when I was in Goa back in December, I thought things were looking so great. So China and India were having a good honeymoon. Now, 6 months later, there's the clash that is still going on. I hope both sides can, sit down and think a little bit harder about the longer term relations being more important than the moments, feeling or reactions, and so on. Of course, I'm not based in Beijing at this point, so I cannot totally understand why this was happening in the first place. But on the other hand, given that the efforts by the Chinese government on the international stage have not been going too well at all. So if I could ask you to just treat this as one of the strange developments and don't make too much out of it, that would probably be good, unless I have missed something that the people in Beijing may have in mind that I don't know about. So I hope the two countries can really get on the right track and have more exchanges, especially both sides should pay more attention to Santosh Pai's opinions and how the two countries should work together. Where is Santosh? I saw him earlier. Okay, so let me go back to the U.S.-China relations question. I really think in some ways, China's influence on the international stage probably peaked 7 or 8 years ago. Most people don't realize this. In fact, back in 2012, when my former dean at the Yale School of Management was doing this interview with me because we were going to move into a new building on the Yale campus. So he asked me about China, and I said to him, right now, 2012, 2011 is when we really see the peak of Chinese influence on the international stage. I know Professor Yao does not have to agree with me on this, so it's perfectly fine. But it's just my assessment. I think the U.S.-China relations worsening, as Steve Bannon put it. Of course, he's very extreme, but one thing he put it very correctly, that is the Democrats and Republicans cannot even agree on the sun will rise tomorrow on the east side. But 91% Americans agree on one thing, that is the US should be tougher on China. So given that environment overall in the US, so I'm not so optimistic at all on US-China relations. And of course, also on China's side, President Xi has been emphasizing that we should all go back to the original intentions. What are the original intentions of the Communist Party? It is to remove private property and replace it with public state ownership and many other things. So I think with China's willingness to show the true colors of the party's intentions and so on, I think the world has been reacting, and now this coronavirus has only strengthened the discovery process of both sides.
I think, Professor, perhaps because we are running out of time, maybe we can just take a couple of other questions. So we have Professor Abhita Batra with us, a very well-known economist and academician. Professor Batra, would you like to raise maybe a brief question to our panelists?
Yes, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. I hope I'm audible to everybody.
Yeah.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. My first question, the entire build-up of how recovery is going to come about in China has been built on consumption and the other aspect, which is in terms of the 5G technology, in respect to both of these, as far as consumption is concerned, my first question is, given that the domestic consumption continues to remain suppressed, can we hope that the external consumption would be able to step in here and provide the basis for Chinese recovery, particularly given that there is going to be a lagged consumption effect because the other economies, China was the first one to have suffered the pandemic, China is the first one to recover as well. But many other economies around the world have subsequently suffered from the pandemic and also undertaken the lockdowns and shutdowns. So we are going to see a lagged effect as far as consumption shortages from around the world is concerned. How do you think this external component of lagged consumption effect is going to affect or impact upon the pace of recovery in China? That's my first question. The second question is in terms of the 5G technology, which again, as you're saying, is going to be one of the means, new infrastructure is going to be one of the means, an investment in this as the basis of recovery in China. My question here is, in case of, or as against the old infrastructure where it was largely the government investing, in case of 5G and the digital applications, there is now an emphasis also in involving the private sector enterprise. And in fact, seeking private investment and seeking market participation for digital applications. Do we see this boost in supply of 5G coming from the private sector without necessarily having a similar kind of boost in demand for 5G applications by the consumer at this time or even in the immediate post-COVID period? That's my second. And I have a very brief third question, which is...
I think, Mr. Batra, I think we are running out of time. So, Professor Yao Yang, you have heard these two questions. I mean, we have spoken a little earlier about the fact that maybe the recovery of domestic demand has not really grown as significantly as we might have wished. So the question is whether there is an expectation that export demand is something that could make up for something for that, given the fact that the global economy is in a rather depressed state. Do you see a possible way out in terms of perhaps a recovery of export from China in the near future? That was one, and the second, of course, is with regard to the 5Gs.
Well, they say that if you look at the main data, surprisingly, China's export grew by 1.4%. Okay, so
but that was mainly because of the medical equipment and medical supplies, isn't it? I mean, that was perhaps a short-term growth related to that.
That could be. That could be. But anyway, it's a positive. Right? Actually, the April figure was not that bad. Right? So the thing is that in China, we actually don't rely much on export anymore. Okay, I think for the whole year, if export had, say, negative 5% growth, and that's fine for the Chinese economy. Okay, and more important is how to boost the domestic consumption. Okay, so that's why consumption coupon and also subsidies to those really poor people will be important. As I said, the government has pledged 2 trillion RMB, which is $300 billion US. Right? Money can be wholly spent on people to raise people's income, and then consumption will be boosted. Right? In terms of 5G, the technology is already there. It's just a matter of how to build up the infrastructure. So this time, the central government says, okay, we can do some investment. The investment should be concentrated on 5G. I don't think 5G technology will absorb all the newly increased investment, because that's 1.6 trillion RMB, right? So that's a lot of money. So I don't think 5G technology can fully absorb them. So we still need to spend the money on like a subway, highways, all sorts of things.
Okay. We have a short time left, so there are a few hands which have gone up. Ambassador Saurabh Kumar, you wanted to ask a question?
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. I have a question about the foreign exchange reserves, holdings of China, even before COVID.
You have, we can't hear you now, Saurabh.
I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
I'm afraid your voice is cut off.
I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please go ahead. We can hear you.
Thank you. I was saying, my question is about the foreign exchange holdings, foreign currency holdings of China. Even before COVID, there was a problem in our understanding, maybe incorrect, and please correct me if I'm wrong. There was a problem of utilization. Only about 1.3, 1.5 trillion dollars worth were reported to be held in US Treasury bonds. The remaining 3, there was no outlet known. How will it be affected by the COVID situation now, you think? And do you think, how is it a concern that the US capital markets are going to be closed or likely to be closed for Chinese companies to raise funds? Thank you. Is it?
Maybe I can take this. At this point, there's more worry about whether the U.S. government would actually seize or freeze all the assets, whether they are treasury bonds and other assets that are held by the foreign exchange reserves and other government agencies in China. There's less worry about the U.S. restricting Chinese capital going into the U.S. Treasury market and things like that. But it is a concern for the managers of the foreign exchange reserves the Chinese government holds, how such reserves are invested and managed. Because the U.S. capital markets overall are by far the biggest. So that's why no matter how the political rhetoric is going between the two governments, still the foreign exchange reserves have been buying more and more U.S. treasuries, even though recently there may have been some decline or some even redemptions out of the U.S. Treasury market, as some U.S. congressmen have been calling on the U.S. Treasury Department to basically walk away from the debt the U.S. Treasury owes to the Chinese, national institutions such as SAFE. But so far, I think it's just talk, no action. Personally, I don't think the U.S. Treasury Department will actually do such a thing because anyway, in American history, nothing like this has happened. It's not just to do something like this to hurt China, but also it would have big implications, big repercussions for how U.S. Treasury yields will be determined going forward. Yeah. But now because there's less, there's less than slightly less than $3 trillion US of foreign exchange reserves. So the pressure has been much reduced over the last 5 years in terms of how China can place the foreign exchange reserves?
Well, this is a so-called Great Bay Area idea. Has been floating over there for many years, at least 3 or 5 years. So I don't think that's new. The new thing was actually Hainan province or Hainan Island. The whole island is going to become a free hub. Okay, not just a free trade zone, but a free hub. What does that mean? We still don't quite understand, but it seems that the whole island is going to open up, right? And probably is going to adopt going to have different laws than the laws implemented on the mainland, right? So that's quite new, and we really don't know the end results. But it seems it's a move that China want to take to show the world that China still has the will to open up.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I think we are now completely out of time. So Ashok, can we wrap this up now?
Yeah, please do that, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I think all of us participating in this webinar would agree that this has been a most stimulating interaction with two very, very distinguished professors from China, Professor Chen Zhiwu and Professor Yang. They have been very patient and very open in their replies to all the different questions that have been raised. I think if you ask me what has really emerged from this interaction, I would like to just flag a few points. One is that I think there is no doubt that after this COVID pandemic, and if we do not see a further perhaps resurgence of this pandemic in China, there is no doubt that China is perhaps one of the first major economies to start recovering from the after effects of this pandemic, because it means that China has been responsible in the last several years for something like 30% to 35% of global growth. So recovery of the Chinese economy will have a favorable impact on the recovery of the global economy. So that is one aspect, that the recovery of the Chinese economy, it may be somewhat slower than some people expect, maybe somewhat faster than other people expect, but essentially the recovery seems to be in motion as far as China is concerned. The second point is that from what we hear, it still remains the case that China's prosperity is very closely linked to, in fact, the globalization of the Chinese economy. And even though perhaps China is less dependent upon exports, perhaps less dependent upon foreign investment, that it is very difficult, even if we are talking about decoupling, it is very difficult to actually see in the foreseeable future that there would be in fact decoupling of, for example, the Chinese economy and the American economy. I mean, to me, it seems that they are really joined at the hip. And if an unraveling takes place, unraveling will affect very negatively both the American economy as well as the Chinese economy. But that is something that we have to wait and see how it begins to unfold. My own sense was that this meeting in Hawaii between Secretary of State Pompeo and Yang Jiechi, State Councillor, to me it appears to in fact demonstrate that both sides, despite the tensions which have been growing between them over the last few years, I think are conscious of the fact that there is that kind of very, very dense interlinkage, and that has to be managed. Even if there is a growing sort of support for decoupling on both sides, that has to be managed. So I do think that maybe we might see some amelioration of those tensions in the coming days. The third element, of course, is that China's role in terms of its linkages with the very dynamic East Asian economies, its linkages through the Belt and Road Initiative. These are going to be very important in terms of China's own role in the global economy going forward. And it appears to me that even though there may be some setback to that, this is something to which China is and Chinese leadership is very much committed, and we will probably see this resuming momentum in the none too distant future. Of course, let me end by also hoping that the recent incidents at the border between India and China do not have a very long-term impact in terms of the very obvious economic complementarities that our two countries enjoy. China has been looking at India as perhaps one of its most dynamic markets, expanding markets. You just have to look at the mobile market in India. The Chinese companies have been the main beneficiaries of that expanding market, and a lot of the digital economy in India also China has made a contribution. So it would be a pity if these economic complementarities are affected negatively by what has been happening at the border, and we do hope that these are resolved in the days to come. So with that, let me first of all thank Ashok and the ICS for organizing yet again a very, very important and very stimulating interaction on China. Thank you so much. And I would also like to extend our gratitude on behalf of all the participants and on behalf of the ICS to Professor Yao Yang and to Professor Chen Zhiwu for taking time off their busy schedule to be with us and to have this very interesting interaction. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for participating.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Pado.
Thank you.